My name is Dr. Caroline Zickgraf, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Liège in the Center for Ethnic and Migration Studies. In my PhD, I studied Moroccan transnational family networks. So I worked on families who were divided between different countries, working in Oujda, Morocco, which is a city near the Algerian border, and also in Liège, here in Liège, Belgium. Well, the first thing is that there is no singular transnationalism theory. So because transnationalism developed primarily in the early 1990s by a group of anthropologists working in the United States, and what they wanted to do was come up with a concept or perspective, conceptually and theoretically, that could describe what they were seeing in their fieldwork, which were the connections between migrants living in the United States and their countries of origin, which in this case were the Caribbean and Latin America primarily. So for some people, transnationalism is primarily cross-border activities. So the actual crossing of borders of goods or people. For other peoples, it's a social relationships. So relationships that are maintained across international borders. And for others, it can be about family. So in my case, I work primarily with families, but you can also look at it from a co-development perspective. So organizations or associations that work on development in countries of origin of migrants. It's about connections that cross international borders. And in migrant transnationalism, it's specific to migrant populations and typically their country of origin, but can also be with other countries where migrants are living, which is one of the things I did in my work. So remittances are given a lot of attention in literature because certain migrant populations send quite a bit of money back to their country of origin, which of course has implications for development in the countries of origin, which can be incentivized by the states. But remittances is just one dynamic. And even when we talk about material practices such as remittances, it can also be the giving of gifts or sending letters, which can also be a form of communication. So for example, in my work, within families, I looked at 3 categories, which are material exchange, so it includes remittances, also gifts, and then communication, so Skype calls, phone calls, letters, etc., and also visits, so people physically visiting either their country of origin or people from the country of origin visiting their migrant relatives or contacts abroad. Liège is an important place to understand the history of migration, Moroccan migration to Belgium. And that's because Liège was one of the first destinations for Moroccan migrants. Because even before 1964, which is traditionally considered the kickoff to massive Moroccan migration, Moroccans were coming to Liège to work in industries around Liège, so the mines, for example. And then in 1964, they signed a bilateral agreement between Belgium and Morocco to facilitate what was at the time called guest worker migration. But there was still a strong tendency to move to Liège and the area around Liège because of the industries, which after World War II needed rebuilding, needed low-skilled labor to come in and supplement the labor force. So Moroccan migration began even before 1964 to Liège specifically, but Liège then became one of the central places, but while Moroccan migration expanded to other places. And now Moroccan migration continues to Liège, even though obviously the guest worker program is concluded. It's 50 years. This year is the 50th anniversary of the bilateral agreements. But it's continued for reasons like what we call chain migration. So once you have family members or social contacts in Liège, it's much easier to migrate to Liège because you have information about that place. You have contacts that can house you, can help you to find work. And then we have family reunification. So families being built in Liège, which then perpetuates migration to Liège. So even though now we have an economic crisis, there's still Moroccans coming directly to Liège, in addition to the families that have grown, the second and third generation, people who've born here and whose even grandparents have been born here at this point. On one hand, we don't have a lot of statistics built around the Moroccan population socioeconomic profile specifically to Liège, but at the same time, when we talk about first or second generation, sometimes you're kind of comparing apples and oranges. So when we say the first generation and we're talking about people who came through the bilateral accords, then you have a lot of people who had maybe a lower education or socioeconomic background who came to work in the mines, and then their children, comparing them to their children, that second generation. Or we're talking about comparing, for example, the first generation who comes today to work at the University of Liège or to do their PhDs and who come from a much higher socioeconomic background. Second generation, in this case, this is one of the problems in assessing their socioeconomic profiles, because it's sometimes difficult to locate them if they already have Belgian citizenship. Moroccans, for example, that there's still a lot of Moroccan remittances sent, but there are other populations who maybe in the first place don't send as many remittances, or there's a drop-off between the first generation and the second generation. Once you lose that social relationship with the country of origin, you might then revert to development projects, for example. So the second generation might continue to do remittances and send money, but they might do so for different purposes or in different schemes. So instead of sending it directly to their parents or children in the country of origin, they might funnel it through associations to build schools in their country of origin or other development projects. So you might see remittances that continue, but the motivations can change. So for some people in the second generation, they're still supporting family members. So to say, like in the Moroccan case, that then it becomes community level is very difficult, because it depends what family means. What are the obligations that are associated with family, even in the second generation? So people maybe still have an obligation to support their grandparents, or in certain African communities where a family is conceived of much more broadly, and your obligations towards your family can continue into the second generation. So that's when it becomes very important to understand cultural ideas of family, social ideas of family that can then influence the second generation's practices. Okay. It wasn't always that people didn't participate in transnational practices in the second generation. People that were born in Belgium. Actually, in the Moroccan population in Belgium, and not just in my work, but we see in general in different surveys that have been conducted as well, that the second generation actually maintains really strong practices. So sometimes there's almost no difference in the percentages in surveys between the first generation and second generation in terms of remittances. So there's one study that says 60% of both first and second generation remit money to a family member. And because family relationships are so important, often you would see that parents who were born in Morocco could have very strong relationships with Oujda because their sisters were living there, and their relatives that they grew up with, and so they wanted to keep that contact and make phone calls, for example. But the second generation in some cases had more of an indirect connection. So mom is calling her sister in Morocco and passes the phone if you're at the house. So then you talk to your aunt in Morocco, but because your mom is actually the conduit, so you're still participating in transnationalism, but maybe it's not you who picks up the phone to call them. That's one example that I saw quite often. Or visiting also depends on age. So a lot of children may go back to Morocco with their parents, because their parents are again instigating that practice, bringing their children to visit Oujda, and then maybe when they're in college, they don't have as much time to visit, which can also be true for the first generation. But maybe they're not going with their parents every year because of university or work or other obligations. So it's also about life phase and age and all of these distinctions. Financial remittances always have a social dimension. But it could be, for example, that with the intervention of state or associations that, people send remittances and not have social relationships. So maybe they have kind of a more distant identification, a Moroccan identity or Belgo-Moroccan identity, but they don't have relatives, which maybe then they send money through associations. So their way of engaging with the country of origin is not actually on a family basis, but on an association basis. So they still feel connected to Morocco, social relationships, or they might be engaging in social remittances in the way of ideas and knowledge transfer, but not directly between families. But I think the bigger question in general is always that in whatever form it may come, what will we see in the future with any population, with transnationalism? Will it go down eventually? Will people, for example, be less and less likely to marry a person of Moroccan origin in the fourth generation? Because right now we're seeing a relatively high number of people who do so, but in the future that could very much impact their relationship with Morocco if their children are, part German and part Moroccan, or the fourth generation who really has no family in Morocco and has intermarried and all these things. So the Moroccan state, over the course of the very long trajectory of mass migration to Europe, has taken various approaches to immigrants abroad. So one of the things that they do now is, or that they have done, is that Moroccans can't get rid of Moroccan citizenship. So even the second generation automatically has Moroccan citizenship, which is one way to keep the population in a way connected. But now they have things like ministries that are ministries for the Moroccans resident abroad, which are specifically targeting engaging with the Moroccan population outside of Morocco, first, second, third generation. And so you have entire parts of the government whose job is to work with migrants and their descendants. You also have things like, in the past you've had incentives for remittances. Different periods in the history of the state, they've incentivized financial remittances. You now have programs that facilitate visits. So they have Operation Transit or Operation Welcome, which facilitates Moroccans living in Europe and abroad visiting Morocco, especially in the summertime. And they facilitate a massive amount of visits because Moroccans tend to visit quite often, especially in the European case. It's not that far, you can drive. So what they do is put out an annual guide with, for example, maps. So how do you drive to Morocco from France? How do you drive from Spain? And all of these things, which is remittances. So if you facilitate visits, you're maintaining a relationship with Morocco. You're trying to encourage that. Also, people spend money on their vacations. So it's also all connected. Ways of maintaining a relationship in any form can be connected to remittances as well. It doesn't have to be the sole purpose of the program, but it can be a byproduct.